Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about designer DNA and the human pursuit of perfection. So this is a photo that was taken while I was on holiday on the Wild Coast in Coffee Bay. And I think looking at this picture, I think we can all agree that it is a beautiful picture. But one word that I wouldn't use to describe it is perfect. That's because perfection is extremely subjective. It depends on each individual's own standard of perfection, which is shaped through our values, beliefs, and experiences. So because of the subjectivity, it's difficult to judge something as perfect if everyone's definition of perfect is different. And this kind of makes perfection irrelevant. Nature isn't meant to be perfect, nature just is, but we love to appreciate it all the time nonetheless. So why can't we apply the same standard to humans? Why must we always strive for this impossible standard of perfection? Humans, I like to think of humans as a part of nature. We are meant to be, we are living, breathing creatures. But unfortunately, our society is moving further and further away from us being a part of and in touch with nature. And one way we are doing this is through our obsession with perfectionism. This constant striving towards perfection is evidenced in so many fields and industries in society, and it is what has led us to where we are today in the field of biotechnology. So we've been genetically modifying crops for years to make them bigger and better, which is actually a debate in itself. But now we're actually able to genetically modify the genes of human embryos, thanks to the latest genetic modification technology, CRISPR. This is similar to the technology used for GMOs, but it's a lot better, cheaper, and faster. And it's constantly evolving, so you can imagine geneticists and scientists are extremely excited by it. But it's just a matter of time before someone gets a little bit too excited and takes it a step too far. So to understand this a little bit better, there are two important distinctions. Firstly, between somatic and germline gene editing, and secondly, between therapy and enhancement. So gene editing at a somatic level is basically editing the genes of somatic cells, which are most of the cells in your body. Hair cells, skin cells, brain cells, blood cells. So the changes made to these cells don't pass on to future generations. And then with germline gene editing, you're editing the genes of sperm, eggs, and early embryos. So with this, the genes are passed on to future generations. So the difference here is very profound because with germline gene editing, you're essentially changing the DNA of future generations and influencing the human gene pool and human evolution. So, and then there's therapy and enhancements, and these are different ways gene editing can be used. So for therapy, it's to treat people with diseases. So it's like for health reasons in medicine. But enhancement is just giving healthy people extra advantages. So these two distinctions overlap with each other, and you get somatic therapy, which is like medicine, editing the DNA of somatic cells to treat genetic diseases such as sickle cell anemia and HIV. And then you get somatic enhancement, which is like genetic plastic surgery, which isn't being practiced anywhere yet, but and there's not a lot of research on that. And then there's germline therapy, which is basically curing future generations of genetic disorders, which is a noble feat in itself, but the problem with crossing the line from somatic therapy to germline therapy is you risk crossing the line from germline therapy to enhancements. And that's where designer babies come in. Designer babies, this is basically editing the genes of reproductive cells for enhancement reasons or cosmetic reasons. So what exactly are designer babies? Well, we're all familiar with IVF, in vitro fertilization, which has been around since the 70s and which have helped couples everywhere conceive a child. So designer babies are genetically enhanced offspring created when the genetic code of embryos created through IVF are rewritten with traits parents find desirable. So the idea of being able to select certain genes for your child, like hair color, eye color, intelligence, athletic ability, all sorts of things, is extremely exciting to some. But and I argue that this is due to the nature of our society, always striving towards perfection, always trying to find happiness in superficial places like this. But a lot of people don't realize that it could be extremely consequential for society and raise a number of ethical concerns. This is a hypothetical situation at the moment because we haven't quite passed the lab experimentation phase, but we're a lot closer to it being a reality than a lot of people realize. And that's because it's not actually illegal in a lot of places. It is banned in at least 25 countries, but in a lot of other countries, the rules are a little bit more ambiguous, like in South Africa. In the US and China, for example, they have restrictions but no outright laws against it. So the first designer baby is likely to come from one of these places. So what are the risks? There are so many risks and concerns that I could probably go on talking for a very long time, but I'm going to try to keep it brief. So safety risks. As fast and precise as this technology is, things can still go wrong, and it's not perfect. So it poses serious safety threats to humans, such as by mistake introducing a mutation into the genome of a human embryo, or through trying to cure a sick person could make them sicker. So it is dangerous and risky. And then another concern is that it holds enormous magnitude because we'd ultimately be messing with the human gene pool. We could have huge influence over the human population and affect our evolution, and allow for unintended consequences to occur, such as introducing a mutation into our gene pool. And it's also a big ethical debate whether or not it's even right to change the DNA of future generations without their consent. Lack of human variation and diversity. So even if everything goes well and no mistakes are made and this new generation of perfect people are produced, this perfect would be according to a single standard. And ultimately, we would lose our range of human variation and cultural and biological diversity, which is terrible because there is strength in diversity. And then not everyone agrees on what conditions are diseases or what needs fixing. For example, a lot of people think that dwarfism is a disease, but a lot of other people would disagree, such as dwarfs themselves, because they're not actually suffering. And the thought of eliminating dwarfs from the human population is pretty unethical, because only a select few consider them as imperfect or faulty. So it's likely that someone will cross this line and offend an entire generation of, or an entire community of people and marginalize them even more from society. And then the costs limited to the wealthy. So even if we manage to overcome the logistical and technical issues, it will still be expensive, and not everyone will be able to afford it, and only it will be limited to a very small portion of society. So this will create a divide between those who can afford it and those who cannot. And these economic divisions would likely adapt into genetic divisions, and this would, either intentionally or unintentionally, a new genetic hierarchy could be established. And this would generate huge inequalities and only add to the list that divides society. Hyperparenting. So this is already seen everywhere. I mean, parents with high expectations of their child and insisting on their parents becoming what they want them to be, which limits the freedom of the child. And these are the type of parents who will likely take an interest in genetic modification. People who are willing to spend this amount of money will likely carry this sense of perfectionism. And through allowing designer babies, this will just perpetuate this type of parenting. Whereas children should actually just be seen as gifts and accepted as they come, instead of treated as products of ambition and perfectionism. So this perfectionism is the bigger problem. It drives consumerism as people believe that they can spend their way to happiness. And it's this perfectionistic society which has created the market for designer babies. But consumerism and perfectionism has never been and will never be the source of happiness. And allowing genetic enhancement to take hold in society will only perpetuate this trend. So this way of thinking permeates society in every corner and is a huge threat to personal happiness and fulfillment. And it makes sense why. Because if we are constantly striving towards this end goal of perfection, which doesn't really exist, then we are constantly going to be disappointed because we can never reach that point. So it's important that we just look within ourselves, and we attribute this perfection to superficial things, such as beauty, athletic ability, intelligence, career success, a nice house. And we think that once we achieve these things, we're going to be happy. But there's always going to be something to add to the list, and we'll never be satisfied. So that's why perfection isn't the answer, and designing our babies isn't the answer. And I really think that it's important that we tread carefully when it comes to designer babies, and if it's not banned completely, then strict restrictions need to be put in place so we don't stray too far from genetic therapy to genetic enhancements. Because if we do, we'll be a society completely lost to this ideal of perfectionism and completely out of touch with nature. So instead, we really need to look within ourselves to find happiness and accept our flaws and imperfections, just like we accept the flaws and imperfections of nature. Thank you.